Germany sent an entire army to capture a single city on the Volga River and lost it completely, all 250,000 men, in a battle that changed the entire trajectory of the Second World War. This is the story of 5 compounding mistakes that turned Germany's own summer offensive into the worst single military defeat the Wehrmacht suffered in the entire war. A defeat so total that the army sent to capture the city simply ceased to exist by the time the fighting finally ended. By the summer of 1942, German forces on the Eastern Front had recovered from the previous winter's failure outside Moscow and launched a new offensive, codenamed Case Blue, aimed at seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus region and securing the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, an industrial center and transport hub that carried both practical and symbolic weight given the city's own name, a name neither Hitler nor Stalin was ever likely to treat as strategically interchangeable with any other city on the map. German forces advanced rapidly through the summer months, and initial fighting for Stalingrad's own outskirts began on August the 23rd, 1942, opening with a massive air offensive that reduced large sections of the city to rubble before German infantry ever reached its streets. By November of that same year, the German Sixth Army fighting inside Stalingrad itself had been completely encircled by a Soviet counteroffensive. And by February of 1943, that army had ceased to exist as a fighting force entirely, its surviving commander surrendering to the Red Army rather than following his own Führer's explicit order to fight to the last man and the last bullet, regardless of the cost. Mistake number 1. Hitler split his own summer offensive into 2 separate, simultaneously pursued objectives rather than concentrating German strength on a single achievable goal, a decision made against the advice of several of his own senior commanders, who understood better than anyone in Berlin exactly how thin German reserves had already become after a full year of continuous fighting on the Eastern Front. Case Blue's original plan called for capturing the Caucasus oil fields first, then securing Stalingrad afterward to protect that operation's own exposed flank once the main objective had already been achieved and German forces could concentrate fully on holding what they had taken. Hitler instead divided Army Group South into 2 entirely separate army groups partway through the summer. Army Group A driving toward the Caucasus and Army Group B driving toward Stalingrad, both operations running at full strength at the same time across an increasingly stretched, increasingly thin front line hundreds of miles long. When senior commanders, including Field Marshal Wilhelm List and General Franz Halder, the Army's own Chief of Staff, raised concerns that the dual offensive was stretching German flanks dangerously thin, Hitler dismissed both men from their positions rather than reconsider the plan itself. The decision multiplied the length of front German forces needed to defend by a considerable margin, spread already limited fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements across 2 major offensives instead of 1, and left neither operation with the reserves it would eventually need once Soviet resistance stiffened in the autumn months ahead. Fuel in particular became a chronic problem for both prongs of the divided offensive, since the Caucasus operation was itself aimed at seizing the very oil fields the German war machine desperately needed, an ambition that meant the tanks and trucks driving toward those oil fields were, in the meantime, competing for fuel supplies with the separate force simultaneously fighting its way toward Stalingrad along an entirely different axis of advance. Mistake number 2. German commanders relied on poorly equipped Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian Allied armies to guard the long, exposed flanks protecting the German Sixth Army's own position at Stalingrad, despite repeated, specific warnings from those same Allied commanders that their forces could not realistically hold against a serious Soviet attack of any real size or coordination. The Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, assigned some of the most vulnerable stretches of the entire front, were equipped in places with artillery and weapons dating back to the First World War, much of it still horse-drawn rather than motorized, and lacked the heavier anti-tank guns any modern army needed to stop Soviet armor from simply driving straight through a defensive line. Romanian commanders warned German headquarters directly and repeatedly that their own units had been given far too much front to defend with far too little equipment, Individual battalions stretched across 5 and 6 kilometers of open steppe with no realistic hope of concentrating enough firepower at any single point to stop a determined attack. Those warnings went unanswered at the highest levels of German command. Hitler assured his own generals that Italian, Romanian and Hungarian reinforcements could handle the flanks while German forces pursued their primary objectives elsewhere. A statement that struck several officers present as remarkable, given the well-documented condition of the equipment those Allied armies were actually working with that autumn. Romanian officers who survived the coming disaster would later write bitterly of warnings ignored at every level of the German command structure. One commander recording that his own repeated cautions about a 5 or 6 kilometer front, assigned to a single battalion, had gone unanswered right up until the moment the Soviet attack actually arrived, and proved every one of those warnings correct in the worst possible way. Mistake number 3. German intelligence failed to detect or take seriously the massive Soviet buildup preparing to strike those same exposed flanks. A failure of anticipation on a scale that mirrored, in miniature, the same overconfident dismissal of Soviet capability that had already shaped the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa a year and a half earlier, and that German commanders somehow continued to repeat even after the previous winter's brutal lesson outside Moscow should have taught them otherwise. Throughout October and November of 1942, Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky and Nikolai Voronov assembled more than 1 million Soviet troops and roughly 1,000 tanks for a counter-offensive codenamed Operation Uranus, concealing the build-up well enough, despite real logistical difficulties moving that many men and that much equipment into position without detection, that German commanders remained confident right up until the attack itself that the Soviets were incapable of mounting an assault on that scale at all. On November the 19th, 1942, Soviet forces struck the Romanian-held northern flank, and attacks against the southern flank began the following day. Within days, the two Soviet spearheads linked up at the town of Kalash, completing the encirclement of roughly 250,000 Axis soldiers trapped inside and around Stalingrad itself. A catastrophe that unfolded in less than a week against defences German planners had assured themselves, right up until the moment the attack actually began, could not realistically be broken that quickly. Mistake number 4. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring promised Hitler that German aircraft could resupply the newly encircled Sixth Army by air. A promise made without any serious consultation with the officers who would actually have to fly the missions themselves through hostile skies in the dead of a Russian winter, and one that proved catastrophically impossible to keep once winter weather and Soviet air defences were actually factored into the equation, rather than simply assumed away in a briefing room hundreds of miles from the actual airfields involved. The trapped army needed a minimum of roughly 300 tons of supplies delivered every single day simply to survive at reduced rations. A figure some senior officers privately doubted the entire available Luftwaffe transport fleet could sustain even under ideal flying conditions, let alone a Russian winter. The Luftwaffe's actual average delivery through the following weeks came to somewhere between 70 and 100 tons a day. A small fraction of what Göring had assured Hitler his aircraft could manage, and total deliveries across the entire length of the siege reached only around 8,350 tons, far short of what even a single month at the promised rate would have provided on its own. Soldiers inside the pocket were reduced to a third of normal rations within weeks, then to a single loaf of bread shared among 5 men by early December, and eventually to killing and eating their own horses simply to survive the cold and the hunger together, while Göring himself, by several contemporary accounts, spent part of this same period on a private train bound for an extended shopping trip in Paris, rather than personally overseeing the airlift he had promised his Führer would succeed. Letters written home from inside the pocket that winter, many of them collected and never actually delivered, described conditions few of the men writing them expected to survive. One soldier recording simply that fate had decided against them. A line that captured a resignation spreading through the trapped army well before the final surrender ever came. Mistake number 5. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout even after his own field commanders made clear that escape, while the encirclement was still incomplete, or in its earliest days, represented the trapped army's only realistic chance of survival. General Hans Huber told his own commanding officer, Friedrich Paulus, directly and repeatedly, that a breakout was their only chance. Paulus, citing his obligation to obey Hitler's explicit orders, refused to act without direct authorization from Führer headquarters, and that authorization never came, even as the window during which a breakout remained physically possible narrowed further with each passing week of encirclement. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a relief operation that December, codenamed Winter Storm, attempting to fight a corridor through to the trapped army from outside the encirclement with fresh panzer divisions. But Soviet resistance stopped Manstein's relief force roughly 30 miles short of Paulus's own position, close enough that some accounts describe trapped soldiers being able to see artillery flashes on the horizon from the relief column that would never actually reach them. A further Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, tore through the Italian and Hungarian lines, protecting Manstein's own flank soon afterward, forcing his relief force to fall back and ending any remaining realistic hope of rescue for the men still trapped inside Stalingrad itself, a second collapse of Allied-held lines that echoed, almost exactly, the same weakness that had opened the door to Operation Uranus in the first place a few weeks earlier. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943. Reminding him pointedly that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive, a message Paulus understood exactly as intended and declined to act on regardless. He surrendered to Soviet forces the following morning instead, becoming the first German field marshal in history to be taken prisoner, telling fellow officers afterward that he had no intention of shooting himself for what he privately called a Bohemian corporal. Before any of these 5 specific command decisions had fully played out, the fighting inside Stalingrad itself had already been grinding down German forces at a rate few commanders on either side had anticipated when the summer offensive first began. German and Soviet troops fought for individual buildings, floors, and even single rooms across months of close quarters, combat that soldiers on both sides came to call Rattenkrieg, the Rats' War, a style of fighting where traditional advantages in armor and air power meant considerably less than they did in open country, and where a determined defender holding a single stairwell could inflict casualties out of all proportion to the ground actually being contested that particular day. German forces reduced most of Stalingrad to rubble through weeks of bombing and artillery bombardment, only to discover that rubble itself provided the kind of cover and concealment that made the city, if anything, harder to clear rather than easier, once the buildings inside it had already been destroyed and every wall reduced to broken cover a defender could use. That grinding attrition consumed experienced German infantry and combat engineers at a rate the Army's own replacement system struggled to keep pace with well before Operation Uranus ever began, leaving the force actually available to respond to the coming Soviet counteroffensive weaker and considerably more exhausted than raw troop numbers alone would have suggested to anyone reading a map from Berlin rather than fighting from a basement in the city itself. What went wrong? Let's set the 5 mistakes side by side before looking at how they actually fed into each other, because summarized together, they reveal a chain of decisions that no single battlefield report from any one sector of the front could have shown in isolation. Mistake 1. Hitler split Germany's own summer offensive into 2 simultaneous objectives, stretching the front far beyond what available forces could properly defend across both operations at once. Mistake 2. German commanders trusted poorly equipped Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allies to hold the flanks that mattered most, despite repeated, specific warnings from those same allies that they could not realistically do so with the equipment they had actually been given. Mistake 3. German intelligence failed to detect the massive Soviet buildup that struck those same flanks in Operation Uranus, encircling 250,000 Axis soldiers within a matter of days, rather than the weeks or months German planners had assumed any serious counteroffensive would require. Mistake 4. Göring's promised aerial resupply delivered barely a third of what the trapped army actually needed to survive at even reduced rations, a shortfall that turned encirclement into slow starvation. Mistake 5. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout when one might still have saved at least part of the army. And by the time a relief effort was finally attempted that December, it fell 30 miles short and arrived far too late to change the outcome regardless. These 5 mistakes did not happen in isolation from each other, and understanding how each one fed directly into the next matters more than treating any single decision as the sole cause of the disaster on its own. The overextension from splitting the summer offensive directly produced the weak flanks German commanders then had no choice but to hand to under-equipped Allied armies, since there were simply not enough German divisions left over to guard every mile of a front stretched across 2 separate major operations running at the same time. The failure to detect the Soviet buildup turned those already weak flanks from a manageable, contained risk into an actual catastrophe, since a smaller, better anticipated Soviet attack might plausibly have been contained long enough for German reserves to respond in time. While the full, undetected weight of Operation Uranus overwhelmed defences nobody in German command had genuinely believed could be broken that quickly or that completely. The failed airlift and the refused breakout then compounded each other directly and fatally, since Göring's promise of adequate aerial resupply was precisely the justification Hitler used again and again through December and January to reject his own generals' repeated requests to abandon the city and fight their way out, while escape still remained physically possible for at least some of the trapped men. Had any single one of these 5 decisions gone differently, historians studying the campaign have generally concluded the outcome at Stalingrad might well have been a costly, damaging German retreat, rather than the complete and total destruction of an entire field army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. All 5 went wrong at nearly the same time, and each one made the next one measurably worse than it would otherwise have been on its own. A chain reaction that began months before any single soldier inside the pocket ever went hungry, and that no individual commander, however skilled, was ever given the authority to break once it had already started moving. A single thread connects all 5 mistakes more directly than any of them connect to simple bad luck or circumstances genuinely beyond German control. Each one reflected the same willingness to override cautious professional military judgment with political confidence instead, whether that meant dismissing generals who warned against splitting the summer offensive, ignoring Romanian officers who understood their own equipment shortfalls better than anyone in Berlin possibly could, dismissing intelligence assessments that pointed toward a growing Soviet threat on the flanks, accepting Göring's untested promise over the informed skepticism of officers who actually understood what German transport aircraft could realistically carry through a Russian winter, or refusing a breakout that every field commander closest to the actual fighting believed was the army's only remaining chance. That same pattern, professional caution overruled by confident political judgment from further and further behind the actual front line, had already shaped several of the costliest German decisions of the previous 18 months on the Eastern Front, and would go on to repeat itself again at Kursk and in the Ardennes before the war in Europe finally ended. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose own relief force had come so close and still fallen short, later reflected that once the airlift had proven itself unable to sustain the trapped army and the relief column had been turned back. Sixth Army's only remaining strategic value lay in continuing to draw Soviet forces away from other sectors of the front, long enough for Manstein himself to extract other, larger German formations from the Caucasus before they too could be cut off and encircled the same way. A coldly practical assessment that meant Paulus's men were, in the war's final calculation, being asked to die for time rather than for any realistic hope of their own survival or eventual victory at Stalingrad itself. The battle ended on February 2nd, 1943, when the last organized German resistance inside the pocket, a northern group commanded by General Karl Strecker, who held out 2 days longer than Paulus's own headquarters had, finally surrendered to Soviet forces. Roughly 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in the battle's final days, joining a total German death toll inside the siege that reached somewhere in the range of 150 to 160,000 men. a combined figure that meant the 6th Army German Command had marched into Stalingrad that summer had, by the time the surrender finally came, ceased to exist as anything resembling the force it had been only months earlier. Of those taken prisoner, only a small fraction, generally estimated at somewhere around 5,000 to 7,000 men, survived the forced marches and prison camps of Soviet captivity long enough to eventually return home years after the war itself had already ended. A survival rate low enough that surrender at Stalingrad functioned, for the overwhelming majority of the men who chose it over Hitler's order to keep fighting, as a delayed rather than an avoided death sentence. It remains, by total casualties on both sides combined, one of the deadliest single battles in the entire history of human warfare, and the moment historians on both sides of the conflict have generally identified as the point where German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front seized so completely during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa 18 months earlier, passed permanently into Soviet hands for the remainder of the war that followed. A reversal of fortune that had begun, in its own way, with the same overconfidence and the same willingness to overrule cautious professional advice that had already shaped nearly every major German decision on the Eastern Front since the invasion first began. If you want more stories about the operations that came apart from a chain of decisions nobody fully controlled, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.